Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. In today's video we are going to be carrying with us some garlic and holy water as we take an extensive look at the history of one of the most recognisable characters of the entire Attitude Era, and a man who has probably had a far more interesting and illustrious career than most of you realise. Today we are going to be opening the coffin on the spooky wrestling career of the vampire warrior himself, David Heath, better known as Gangrel. Born on February 16th, 1969 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, David began his professional wrestling training at the age of just 17, under the tutelage of the great Boris Malenko, a man who would also train numerous top talents over the years, including his sons Joe and Dean Malenko, Norman Smiley, Sean X-Pac Waltman, and the wall-busting shockmaster himself, Fred Typhoon Ottman. David's first year in wrestling saw him compete in numerous local Florida independent promotions, including a run in IPW, where he got his first taste of championship gold, winning their tag team titles. But his biggest opportunity came in the form of a squash match, when the WWF visited Florida's Sundrome against their own portly police person, the Big Boss Man. Although this only ended up being an isolated appearance for the Fed, it was already clear that young David was destined for great things, and it wasn't long before he was off to Canada to gain some exposure and experience at Stu Hart's Stampede Wrestling, a testing ground for some of the greatest talents the business has ever produced. The Calgary-based promotion would be the ideal place for David to cut his teeth, so to speak. And if you think that would be the last of the vampire puns, then I'm afraid you are sorely mistaken. Get it? During his time in Stampede, David formed a tag team with Tom Nash, known as the Blackhearts. David and Tom would now be known as Blackheart Apocalypse and Blackheart Destruction, respectively, and this new team would be how David would make his name for himself in the early stages of his career. 1989 proved to be an eventful year for our fledgling vampiric hero, especially considering how young he was. It was pretty darn impressive to consider that in addition to his work in Canada, he was putting in miles for many American independents, as well as working as enhancement talent for the NWA and WCW, competing against the likes of the Midnight Express and Abdullah the Butcher. As we all know, enhancement talent is really just a fancy word for jobber, but David's natural in-ring ability was starting to get noticed, and a call-up from the prestigious All Japan Pro Wrestling was just around the corner. AJPW during the early 90s was an absolute hotbed for talent, and David got to work with a veritable who's who of Japanese wrestling within Giant Bubba's promotion. These would include the likes of Kenta Kobashi, Misawa, Jumbo Tsuruta, and Toshiaki Kawada, but also many of the major American imports such as Stan Hansen, Terry Gordy, Dr. Death Steve Williams, and the future head of talent relations himself, one of my favourites, Mr. Personality, John Laurinaitis. It always confuses me because John Laurinaitis sounds like he's got Laurinaitis. He was called Johnny Ace back then anyway, much easier. For such a young chap, the future Gangrel's resume was already starting to look rather impressive. 1991 also saw him compete in the Tri-State Wrestling Alliance and for Herb Abrams' ill-fated UWF. Now the salacious and delicious controversial history of UWF would make another great topic for a whole video, but I'll leave that one for now. It was around this time that the Blackhearts team began being managed by the adopted daughter of the legendary Mad Dog Vachon, Luna. Luna took an instant shine to David and Tom's gimmick, and felt she could add some flair to the team as their valet. This would prove to be particularly significant for David, as he and Luna's careers would become synonymous with each other's, and they would even end up marrying a few years later. The process of them getting together was a bit of a messy one, as she was not only involved with another wrestler in the form of the absolutely terrifying Dirty Dick Slater, but she also wound up marrying her longtime friend and tag team partner of David himself, Tom Blackheart Destruction Nash. Wow. According to his 2017 shoot interview, which is quite literally an interview with the vampire, David states that Luna was desperate to get out of her abusive relationship with Slater, and her extremely short-lived marriage to Nash came about as a result of this. This pairing would bring about what would become the most significant part of David's career, as he and his new partner discovered a shared appreciation for horror movies in general, but more specifically the 1980s vampire classic The Lost Boys. Between them, they concocted a new character for David based on the beloved movie, sporting new gear, a new haircut, eye makeup, and most importantly, fangs. David would now become known as the Vampire Warrior. The first major success for David and his fancy new teeth came at Jerry Jarrett and Fritz von Erich's Memphis-based USWA, where he not only got to compete against huge names such as Jerry Lawler, Dutch Mantell, and Jerry Jarrett's son Jeff, but he also got to win the USWA Southern Heavyweight title, which was by far his biggest accomplishment and push thus far. David didn't get a chance to become too accustomed to winning just yet though, as another run of being enhancement talent was just around the corner. This time in the form of a far more lengthy and significant run with the WWF, where his now wife Luna was also working. He wouldn't be doing it as a vampire yet, however, as the tyrannical maniac, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, decided to shove the poor bugger under a mask, and call him possibly the most generic masked wrestler name in history, the Black Phantom. Although he was mostly staring at the lights in losing efforts, David was gaining an incredible amount of experience, working regularly against well-known superstars such as Lex Luger, the British Bulldog, Razor Ramon, Earthquake, and fellow Boris Malenko trainee, the 1-2 Kid, who David had a series of well-received matches with, many of which were televised. David was now becoming a well-known and trusted hand in the business, with doors opening up for him all over the country, as well as in Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Japan. People were starting to take notice of the Vampire Warrior gimmick, with high-profile matches against Dick Murdoch and Tommy Dreamer for the NWA and ECW being testaments to that. David's time in ECW led to him taking further tours of Japan with the IWAJ, where he was regularly featured in monster matches against their versions of the likes of Freddy Krueger and Leatherface. It was during one of these tours that David was involved in a shoot-fight incident against a supposed karate master. So the story goes, our old pal David upset the promoter, and so was booked against a karate fighter that they had brought in to teach the naughty vampire a lesson. Evidently they hadn't accounted for the fact that either vampires have super strength, or David is just as hard as bloody nails, because rather than to be taught a lesson, he gave the karate man a sound thrashing instead. Pro wrestling is real, you see, martial arts is fake. Further tours with All Japan, more work with the USWA, and some televised matches for WCW, one of which was with the future champagne salesman and bad David Lee Roth impersonator Chris Jericho, would all follow. But ultimately, David knew that he needed to be contracted somewhere to achieve financial security and really get to the next stage of his career. That ambition would be achieved in the summer of 1998, when the WWF came calling with the offer of a contract, and there was no way he was going to refuse. Due to Bruce Pritchard and Vince Russo's love of the gimmick and desire to see a vampire character on WWF programming, David was finally going to get the opportunity he deserved on the big stage. Taking the name from a role-playing game called Vampire the Masquerade, he would now simply be known as Gangrel. The new Gangrel character made his debut against the future Scotty 2 Hottie, Scott Taylor, in a winning effort on Sunday Night Heat before defeating Taylor's future tag partner Brian Christopher, aka Grandmaster Sexay, on Monday Night Raw the very next night. It was clear from the outset that a lot of stock was being put into Gangrel, as the production levels on his entrance was fairly impressive too. He would rise onto the rampway via a platform surrounded by a circle of flames. Couple that with his iconic creepy entrance music and goblet of blood that he carried with him, it's no wonder his walk to the ring is so fondly remembered. He quickly formed a faction with the young up-and-coming fake brother tag team Edge and Christian called the Brood. This new faction became mainly known for their bloodbaths, where they would soak their opponents with massive amounts of red liquid that would mysteriously drop from the roof of the arena onto their unsuspecting victims. Bloody disgusting. On the February 1st, 1999 edition of Monday Night Raw, the Brood were facing members of The Undertaker's sinister Ministry of Darkness faction, when The Undertaker and his cronies hung Gangrel from the ropes with a noose in a very violent angle. This actually led to the Brood joining forces with the Ministry, to form some sort of double spooky faction of Spooky Spooks. This wouldn't last long though, as the Brood soon entered into a feud with the Hardy Boys, which saw Gangrel turning on Edge and Christian to side with the Hardys and form what he would refer to as the New Brood. This new group would also again be short-lived however, as the Hardy Boys soon won the services of the large-breasted Terry Runnels, and unceremoniously kicked their vampire boss to the curb. They decided to trade teeth for tits. This would allow Gangrel to make the move back to singles wrestling, which is how he would finish out the rest of his WWF tenure. Luna would resume her role as his manager, this time on the big stage for much of the latter months of 1999 going into the year 2000. The pair became involved in a brief feud with Miss Jacqueline and competed in a few mixed tag matches here and there, but the notoriously volatile Luna was released from the WWF in early 2000 following some unruly backstage behaviour, so her and her husband's on-screen WWF partnership ended up being a fairly brief one. Gangrel did end up staying with the company for quite a while after this, but he was used sparingly and never really had anything else meaningful to do. Truth be told, outside of a fantastic entrance, some of the angles with the Hardys and the Ministry, our pointy-toothed antagonists running the big time yielded little in the way of memorable moments or matches. Thanks for the memories, I guess. After his exit from the WWF, Gangrel would next find himself back in Puerto Rico, at various indies, and probably most notably at one of the companies formed from the ashes of the now defunct WCW, Andrew McManus's World Wrestling All-Stars. With his wife once again by his side as his manager, he would tour Australia and the UK with a fledgling company before returning to performing at all a manner of indie companies back in his home country in 2002. He even managed to squeeze in a performance for TNA at one of their earlier pay-per-views. David's time in the UK with WWA led to him not only making many contacts there, but also falling in love with the place. And who could blame him? So he began touring here so frequently, he would actually end up living here, often for months at a time, whilst travelling with the likes of All Star on the famous British camp circuit. No doubt getting very pally with Brian Dixon, the UK's closest thing to Vince McMahon. September 2004 saw Gangrel make a surprise appearance on SmackDown and his first appearance for the WWE since it changed its name to WWF, teaming with his former Ministry of Darkness pal Viscera in a 2-on-1 handicap match against The Undertaker. This led to him signing another contract and briefly appearing for OVW, who were the WWE's main development territory at the time. But nothing ever came of it and he was released once again. The following year there was an interest in the Vampire stable led by a fellow neck nibbler Kevin Thorne on WWE's new ECW brand, which led to a dark match between Gangrel and CM Punk, but the idea was promptly scrapped and again nothing ever came of it. David's final appearance to date at least for WWE came the following year on the December 10th edition of Monday Night Raw, in one of those battle royals where they wheel out old legends for a cheap pop. Our plucky hero had gone from potentially signing a new contract to a gimmick battle royal piece of fodder in the space of just a year. Meanwhile, David's personal life had also hit a bit of a rough patch as he and Luna divorced in late 2006. According to the man himself, the excessive and overindulgent partying had caught up with them, and they were becoming toxic to each other. Although they never reconciled their romantic differences, they did remain close friends, until Luna's tragic and untimely passing in August 2010. David remained extremely active on the independent and camp circuits in various countries throughout this period, and although he never really did anything further that you can really sink your teeth into, wrestling-wise, he did enjoy spells at many recognisable places such as WXW, Juggalo Championship Wrestling, Ring of Honor, and even a recent appearance at AEW with Matt Hardy, making reference to their former association in the New Brood. Outside of wrestling, David briefly made headlines in 2007 when he was signed by a media group, the New Porn Order, to direct, well, surprisingly porn. Although he was signed on to direct 12 movies, David almost immediately regretted the decision. He got cold fangs and only ended up directing one scene, before returning to pro wrestling with his proverbial towel between his legs. He has later gone on to admit that it was a terrible decision, and found that his prospects in wrestling had become more limited as a result. Looking back on his career, it's clear that David, or Gangrel, or whatever you want to call him, has had one of the most prolific runs in recent memory. There aren't many workers that can lay claim to appearing in WWE, WCW, NWA, ECW, TNA, Ring of Honor, AEW, All Japan, plus Europe, Puerto Rico and Mexico. Taking into account the fact that he did the majority of that with extremely expensive and I would imagine extremely obstructive surgically implanted fangs, and you have to applaud the man's efforts. I guess it would not be right to not wrap up today's video with a nice pun, so, well, bloody done Gangrel. He staked it all on wrestling. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, be sure to subscribe to the Top Hat Wrestling Man channel for regular historical retrospectives on the lesser told aspects of pro wrestling history. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our upload on the career of Eric Angle, Kurt Angle's weird brother, and make sure you leave us a comment on what you thought of this content. Cheerio!